Okay, a MacGuffin is a plot device in a story used to drive the narrative forward. What the MacGuffin actually is really unimportant. Similarly, I'm going to use Bill Maher to talk about politics, but Maher himself is irrelevant. So this is not meant to be an attack on Maher, but a criticism of how we engage in political discourse today. In fact-checking him, I will be fact-checking our news sources. Okay, despite being posting this video on September 24th, it is for the September 10th show of Realtime with Bill Maher. Sorry for the delay, but it takes me a couple of weeks to investigate the facts and create a video. The sound bites they use to justify their political opinions are usually over-reductionist, and it takes me a while to learn the whole nuanced story. I used to like to watch Realtime with Bill Maher. However, 7 or 8 years ago, I noticed that Maher started to sometimes have the world's worst takes on an issue or two. But I usually gave him the benefit of the doubt and assumed his facts were more or less correct. However, on his show last Friday, he had a panel segment for one of his favorite bugaboos, cancel culture. And perhaps inspired by his guest George Will, it contained several statements that strained credulity. So I decided to fact check them. And what I found was so egregious that I felt the need to share my findings. I should note that the following description of the conversation that happened during the segment isn't presented in the order it happened because I wanted to start with the most checkable facts first. And I apologize for the length. It has grown into sort of a diatribe on cancel culture. I'll start with the last one because it came from George Will. Bill started ranting that it was actually the liberals who were guilty of racism. Without giving any specifics, he said that they wanted to segregate dorms and segregate graduations, and that even the University of Oregon had a lower graduation standards for people of color. He attributed this last one to a George Will column. George continued with the vague comment saying, Oregon got rid of math and reading proficiency requirements for equity reasons. Then the old broken saw, the soft bigotry of low expectations. The story was actually difficult for me to find because George was typically vague and he didn't correct Bill Maher. He said Oregon instead of the state of Oregon, hoping that you would assume he means the University of Oregon, as Bill did. That way he can misrepresent the truth while technically still getting the facts right. Plus he uses a small underreported story that nobody has heard of, so they can't challenge his facts. I could find no story on the University of Oregon's graduation requirements. But thanks to a couple of clues in George Will's response, I found that they were actually talking about the state of Oregon and high school graduation requirements. As you can see, Senate Bill 744 suspends the essential skills testing for 3 years because of COVID-19. But it doesn't cancel them. And it doesn't change the graduation requirements. You can see here from Superintendent Nee's comments. In his district, they never use the essential skills testing for their graduation requirements. So why does George Will claim people of color now have different, lower standards? The bill also has the Oregon Department of Education review the current graduation standards and propose changes that will be more equitable. The second comment is from the governor's press secretary. And she says, it gives Oregon a chance to reimagine and rebuild our education system in a way that more equitably serves Oregon's Black, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, tribal, and students of color. Because of their use of that word, equitable, George Will claims that they mean to have different standards for different races. It does not. It means something like adding a chapter of African American history to the required U.S. history class, or adding Chinese to the list of foreign languages taught. But everyone will be held to the same standard. With a little more digging, I found out that this local story even got fact-checked by Snopes because it had such ridiculous headlines. They claim that the headlines are a mixture of truth and falsehood. But if you look closely, there is a contradiction. Snopes claims that the tests were a graduation prerequisite. But from the previous article, Superintendent Nee said his schools had never used them as such. Luckily, Snopes had a link to the actual bill, so I could look it up. You can see here in Section 3 of the bill, it says, Notwithstanding any rules adopted by the State Board of Education, a student may not be required to show proficiency in essential learning skills as a condition of receiving a high school diploma during the 21-22, 22-23, or 23-24 school year. Because of that may not language, it appears that the essential learning skills testing requirement was never state law, but just something a few schools did on an individual basis. What I think happened was that under Leave No Child Behind, schools were evaluated using these standardized testing, but the students weren't. So a few underperforming schools were worried that the students were not trying as hard as they could on the test. So they made the testing a graduation requirement, but it wasn't statewide. So to sum up, the list of falsehoods in this one sentence, they were talking about the state of Oregon, not the University of Oregon. The state suspended the proficiency exams. They didn't cancel them. The exam was never really a requirement by state law, and the requirements will be the same for all students. The second egregious falsehood I had heard before, I think from Bill last week. He claimed that Seattle had voted to decriminalize crime. He was really animated during this segment, saying things like the liberals were embarrassing him, and if what the liberals are doing sounded like an Onion headline, they should stop. This one was actually easy to find because it was all over the right-wing blogosphere. As you can see, there was no bill, no vote. It was just one councilwoman who proposed it, and the council didn't even discuss it. They tabled it, and there's no word of it ever becoming a bill or ever being discussed again. It was not a proposal to decriminalize crime, but to give defendants the affirmative defense of poverty. It was for misdemeanors only, not felonies. An affirmative defense is like duress. You will likely be found guilty and given a sentence, but they might take the duress as a mitigating circumstance and give you a lighter sentence. It will be up to the judge and jury how much of a factor it is. And the mayor said she would veto it even if it ever crossed her desk. And the city attorney said he already takes poverty into consideration when deciding which cases to prosecute and what kinds of sentence they ask for. So to sum up the list of falsehoods in this one sentence fragment, there was no vote, no bill, no support from the mayor, just a proposal for a discussion by one councilwoman, and the other members of the council didn't even want to discuss it. It doesn't decriminalize crime, it just adds the possible affirmative defense of poverty. It's not for major crimes, it's not for minor crimes, it's only for misdemeanors. It doesn't negate any legal consequences, it just mitigates. And poverty is already considered as a mitigating factor by the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. George Will then goes on his usual rant about coddling children. He talks about mandating harmony, participation trophies, and safe spaces, suggesting that any controversial ideas are not allowed on campus. He claims that Brandeis University has put a trigger warning on the words trigger warning. Maher agreed and then claimed that the National Archive put a trigger warning on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The National Archives addressed this claim themselves on Twitter about 200 times. If you go to the National Archives catalog search, you will see that the harmful language alert is indeed not connected with any particular item, but part of the banner. If you click on the link to read their statement, they seem to be more concerned with graphic imagery. They want to keep the archive's material open to everyone, but they want to give parents and teachers a warning that children probably shouldn't surf around unsupervised. Sort of like an R rating on a movie. Oh, and Will's comment about Brandeis? It wasn't the whole university, just one community center that counsels to victims of violent crime. So, in summary, the National Archives wants to keep access open and free to all. The warning isn't for the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, just a general statement. And it's a warning, much like an R rating on a movie, there to inform parents and teachers that children shouldn't surf around unsupervised. So those were the three big misconceptions or falsehoods that were said during the segment. Just to summarize, when you're trying to find information, read the whole article. Don't just read the headline. It's obvious that Bill is just reading headlines. He's reading these sensational headlines and he's saying, that looks like The Onion. Well, it looks like The Onion because it's deceptive. It's good to read the whole article to see what it's actually about. And if there are sources, hopefully there are sources, right? Don't take this article's word for it if there aren't sources. So hopefully there are sources, and if there are, go ahead and check those sources. You'd be amazed at how many times article puts a link to that source, and if you go to the source, it says the exact opposite of what the article is saying. But above all, talk to the experts. And I'm not talking about like the talking heads on TV or George Will. George Will isn't an expert in anything. Bill Maher isn't an expert in anything. Go to the actual experts, people who work in universities. Okay, so this really isn't a fact check, but Bill Maher began the segment talking about 4 teachers who quit because of so-called cancel culture. He said it was a big problem. He said it was a movement. They quit because they think there's a liberal agenda in grade school to cancel white history and replace it with a false narrative called critical race theory. There was really no fact check for me to do with this because he just read their bigoted statements. So I decided to check and see if they really got canceled or if they quit because they were prevented from canceling others. And if this was a sizable movement or just a handful of opportunists. First up is Jonathan Kopel. Maher quoted from his speech at a school board meeting that was 5 months ago. He said, "A man cannot menstruate. A man cannot lactate and breastfeed a child. You cannot give birth if you're a man. If you want to be an adult and do whatever you want with your life, I'm okay with that. Just don't push this ideology on children. I'm not going to work in a district that's okay with that. Parents are already pulling their kids out of public school. They're going online. This is going to increase as this liberal ideology comes into our schools. This isn't a political indoctrination camp, okay? It's a public education. We want to teach education, not left-wing ideas that aren't backed up by facts or science." End quote. Despite threatening to quit, John did not quit. What got John so animated? This video by a for-profit education company called BrainPop. The video teaches the pronoun they can be used either as a plural or as a singular, and gives an example of the singular case. Moby says, "I'm going to see my friend." And Tim responds, "Where do they live?" The video explains that since Tim does not know if Moby's friend is a boy or a girl, he uses the pronoun they instead of he or she. But instead of using the phrase boy or girl, the video says, since Tim does not know the gender identity of Moby's friend, blah, blah, blah. Kopel insists that since the video uses the phrase gender identity, they were secretly teaching kids about transgender identity and pronouns. Jonathan Kopel is a moron. He is also a performance artist. Notice how he's mugging for the camera as he plays the video from his phone, instead of looking at the school board. He posted this video to his very own YouTube channel, and the story somehow got picked up by all the right-wing news sources like Newsmax. As he did a round of interviews on the right-wing vlogosphere, he started a website to sell t-shirts that say Brave Teacher on them. He also seemed to be trying to cash in on his 15 minutes of fame by getting a recording contract. On his website, he claims that he got fired for his conservative views, but did he? Turns out, no, I don't think so. He has a history of organizing events with Turning Points USA. Last year, in the middle of the third wave of COVID, he decided to have an unsanctioned super spreader event / Christian rock concert to protest the lockdown. And about a month ago, he went to his school's in-service without a mask. When he was reprimanded for violating their mask mandate, he presented a medical exemption form. He then went on to another school board meeting to protest the mask mandate. He doesn't say what happened in the meeting, only that he got banned from attending a meeting ever again. That weekend, he had an anti-masking event. Looking at the pictures of his anti-mask rally in the local paper, I noticed one showing them distributing mask exemption forms. He was later fired. He was vague on whether it was before or after the rally. I don't know why he was fired, but if he forged medical records, that would probably do it. And a couple of postscripts to the story. In his blog where he uses the third person to talk about himself, he claims that his video got 10 million views in less than 48 hours, and then it got banned. Well, I found it on YouTube very easily, so I don't think it got banned. This one's been up since May 10th, and you can see it's here September 1st he's claiming to get banned. And it doesn't have 10 million views. It's got a little over 5,000 views. Now, unless there's some other video hosting site that's even bigger than YouTube, I don't think he's being honest. You can also check that he's also, in addition to trying to become a rock star and selling t-shirts, he is also trying to turn his 15 minutes of fame into a political career. And he wants your money. He's got a Give, Send, Go account under Louisiana Teacher. And I think he's going to need your money because he is not going to win that lawsuit. Next up is Laura Morris. And she did quit right in the middle of a school board meeting. But it wasn't over critical race theory. This year, the state legislature of Virginia mandated that every school district adopt some sort of transgender equality policy. However, the districts were free to develop their policies on their own, make them whatever they want. She teaches in Loudoun County, kind of a conservative county. The one the Loudoun County School Board was voting on was pretty thin. It required school counselors to take diversity training, only school counselors, not the teachers. And the teachers used transgender students' correct pronouns. That's it. A Christian group called Stand Up Virginia organized protests all over the state. They targeted the school board meetings when the school boards would be voting on their newly created policies. The one in Loudoun County had 150 protesters, so many that they had to reorganize the meeting so that they could let all 150 talk. So they turned it into a virtual meeting and they ushered them in one at a time so that they could talk and be on the internet. Laura Morris was one of them. She said her belief in Christ prevented her from using transgender students' preferred pronouns. She has since gotten a job at a local Christian school, making one wonder if the job was worked out beforehand. Then there is Jennifer Tafuto. At the end of last school year, she quit, but gave no reason. Then 3 months later, timed to coincide with the new school year, she put out a video on 1776action.org, a political action committee that formed when Biden canceled the 1776 commission that Trump started to prevent schools from teaching the 1619 Project of the New York Times. The president of 1776action.org, Adam Waldeck, is a close personal friend of Tafuto's family. Jennifer then went on to do many interviews, telling her story and promoting 1776action.org, almost like it was a full-time job. When asked if she's looking for a new job in education, she simply answered by saying that she was exploring her options. Before she quit, Tafuto only worked in a traditional public school for 2 years. And like with Jonathan Koppel, the significant time between they quit or fired and their statements makes one think that that wasn't why they got quit or fired. Last is Peter Boghossian. He's not a teacher, but a philosophy professor at Portland State University. He wanted to cancel the entire field of gender studies. He is part of Barry Weiss's intellectual dark web. He published a hoax postmodernist feminist article in an open access general topic journal that no one reads. Now, I agree that postmodernism is a flawed idea, but only a minority of the researchers prescribe to it, and like all flawed theories, you must let it slowly work itself out of academia through the process of science. But Boghossian and the other members of the intellectual dark web want to topple academia and replace it with dogma. If he really was interested in improving gender studies, he would become an expert in the field, do actual research, and use his empirical evidence to convince his new colleagues that postmodernism is wrong, and reform the field from within, using the scientific method. Publishing a hoax article isn't science, it's a political stunt. If you just read his self-serving letter, published on Barry Weiss's website, he seems reasonable. But after watching several of the videos he links to in the piece, it doesn't seem that he is at all interested in rigorous thought, intellectual exploration, or critical thinking, like he claims. His only guests are right-wing ideologues. There are no liberals, there is no debate, no critical thinking, no learning. The ideologues present their narrative and that's it. Boghossian doesn't debate them, he doesn't ask them to justify their positions. For example, take James Damore. This is a video that Boghossian links to because it gets interrupted. But it's the public lecture that he invited Damore to give at Portland State. Damore wrote the Google's ideological echo chamber memo that supposedly kicked off the intellectual dark web movement. He was a computer programmer working for Google when he circulated an internal memo to the whole company talking about some questionable biological theories that he once read about, or I guess watched on TV or something. His argument was that Google shouldn't worry. They were worried about only 20% of their workforce were female. And Damore's argument was they shouldn't worry about that because women were biologically incapable of doing things like programming or math or stuff like that, I guess. During the first 15 minutes of the talk, Damore presented his side of the story in the most slanted manner, not even mentioning any of his kooky biological ideas. Then the other panel members spoke. They were Helen Pluckrose and Heather Hying, also members of the intellectual dark web and frequent collaborators of Boghossian. They are not there to provide a contrary viewpoint, or to debate James Damore, or to provide any kind of critical perspective. They are there simply to provide him with justification for his amateurish memo. One of them even argued that when liberals suggest a woman could be good programmers, they're actually insulting them because they're saying that they're bad teachers or something. I don't know. It was a weird argument. You can watch it for yourself. It's linked to the Barry Weiss story, links to it, so you can watch this video for yourself. Anyway, it was all one-sided. There was none of the rigorous thought, intellectual exploration, or critical thinking that Boghossian says he does with his guests. Like Bill Maher, Boghossian holds himself as a champion of free speech. But is more free speech really what we need? Maher likes to quote Justice Brandeis, his saying that sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, to justify his platforming of wrong-headed ideas. Ironically, Brandeis wasn't talking about free speech, but government corruption. In this essay by Christian Barnard, he shows that more speech doesn't necessarily lead to greater knowledge. So this is a really good article. I encourage you to read it. I'm just going to read a little bit of it here. Though free societies are absolutely obligated to protect speech that is hateful, grossly ignorant, or unproductive, that does not necessarily mean that such a practice will always lead to greater understanding or enhanced knowledge. Human beliefs are heavily influenced by suggestion, repetition, propaganda, and the authorities people trust. People form their beliefs in ways that are best only loosely resemble reasonable evidence-based thinking. That human beliefs are subject to such chaotic, arbitrary forces undermines the popular adage that sunlight is the best disinfectant. In many instances, indiscriminately amplifying any and all voices is counterproductive to the pursuit of knowledge. As information sharing technology expands, radical extremist groups have managed to reach many more people and grow their ranks. And as information platforms become more powerful, having constructive dialogue may even get more difficult. Free societies must be willing to accept the possibility that absolute free speech will come with an increasingly greater cost to the pursuit of truth. In the modern context, unsurprisingly, a host of psychological weaknesses cripple us when we try to reason and gain high-level knowledge. We struggle to overcome our biases. We are more likely to believe things that we hear more often. We are over-inclined to believe those we trust even when they are poor sources of information. We gravitate to stories over facts. We draw conclusions based on our emotions. We double down on our views in the face of disconfirming evidence, and simply do a terrible job of organizing and weighing information. Culture, language, religion, social status, etc. are all factors that can severely limit the extent to which we are able to truly benefit from free expression and open dialogue. For the sake of argument, assume that the world has two basic groups of people, those who are closed-minded and those who are open-minded. The open-minded are generally truth seekers. They do their best to think clearly, overcome their biases, and not be influenced by their psychological vulnerabilities. As such, they generally consider new ideas carefully, even ideas they disagree with or perceive as unproductive or ignorant. The closed-minded crowd, on the other hand, is generally unwilling to seriously consider their assumptions or biases. They see new ideas that challenge their beliefs as things to be defeated, not carefully considered. He continues a little bit later. Of course, misinformation and disinformation are nothing new, and humans have always been limited in their ability to think critically. Optimists may argue that, given progress we have made thus far, despite our weaknesses, such progress will continue. Technological advancement and the increasing accessibility of information, they may say, could even accelerate progress. Unfortunately, this is probably wrong for one key reason. Open-minded and closed-minded people play by different rules in the public sphere. As information sharing technology gives a platform to both types of voices, it seems very possible that the closed-minded crowd will win more converts. This is because they exploit all the weaknesses of human psychology. They play on fears, they reinforce biases, they oversimplify things into a coherent narrative. These tactics are good both for quickly persuading others and for discouraging them from further inquiry. By contrast, the open-minded crowd's rulebook is characterized by prudence, willingness to be wrong, and a resistance to overly reductionist accounts of the world. This yields circumstances where the closed-minded person is far more likely to change the mind of an open-minded person than the converse. It is an uneven playing field, and the information age could be tipping it more and more in the favor of the closed-minded camp. For the closed-minded group, new technology is a powerful tool for weaponizing and rapidly disseminating information that confirms pre-existing narratives. But for the open-minded crowd, new technology complicates things. It demands far more work of them, requiring them to sort through new facts, qualifying their claims, and moderating their own beliefs. So Bill Maher and Peter Boghossian, their claims to be for free speech doesn't really seem to be liberal like they say it is. They also, Bill Maher, Peter Boghossian, his colleagues, most of the intellectual dark web, they all claim to be liberals, but they promote these conservative ideas. They say it's in the name of free speech and public discourse, and to disinfect things, but we have seen that this isn't true. They invite conservatives to debate, but then they don't debate them. They end up agreeing with them. So what's going on? There is a clue in this essay by Lori Penny on why she won't debate white supremacists like Steve Bannon. Psychologists call it the justification suppression model of prejudice. Like Christian Barnard explained, we are all susceptible to our biases. We are all susceptible to prejudices. This is just how our brains work. In order to process the massive amounts of raw data that we receive from our senses, we categorize, we generalize, we build models. When we are children, usually we learn that we ourselves are susceptible to these biases and prejudices. And we learn how to recognize them, we learn how to avoid them, or to deal with them. However, some people don't. Instead, they learn to suppress their prejudiced opinions because they know those opinions are immoral. They appear liberal, but underneath they have these prejudiced opinions that they're suppressing. Then later in life, as Lori says here, the bigots refrain from directly defending their own bigotry, but get hugely riled up justifying the abstract right to express bigotry. So instead of saying, for example, I don't like foreigners, they'll fight hard for someone else's right to get up on stage and yell that foreigners are coming to convert your children and seduce your household pets. End quote. Boghossian and Maher have an intense desire to express their prejudices, but they can't. So they invite the bigots on to speak and use free speech as an excuse to do it. Lori goes on to explain why there's no value in debating these bigots. For them, just getting invited to talk is the victory because it legitimizes them and their opinions. I encourage you to read her article. I'm not saying cancel culture doesn't exist, but the term is being hijacked, much like Trump hijacked the term fake news. Fake news used to refer to places like Fox News that actually produced fake news. But Trump hijacked it and uses it for any kind of criticism he gets, if it's true or not. But the people being canceled are the ones with no power. Students don't cancel professors, professors cancel students. Teachers don't cancel administrators, administrators cancel teachers. I wish Bill Maher would instead use his platform to inform us about people like Matthew Hahn. Matthew teaches in a rural Tennessee district that is 94% white, and he was fired for teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates. Matthew Hahn was canceled. Where's Bill Maher's rage over this? And there really isn't a debate. His administrators will tell you that they fired him because he taught Ta-Nehisi Coates. They'll justify it by saying they suggested that he teach the Weekly Standard. And when he didn't, they fired him. So if the intellectual dark web and the cancel culture movement and the so-called heterodox academy, I just learned about that one while I was doing my research. If these aren't about refuting postmodernism, if they aren't about advocating for free speech, what are their goals then? Well, we don't really need to guess. One of them wrote a book. Now this book really isn't unique. I mean, there are other books by like Steven Pinker and Michael Shermer, but this was the most recent one. In the book, The Constitution of Knowledge, Jonathan Rauch argues that postmodernism and the rampant cancel culture on campus is evidence that science has gone off the rails, led astray by a mob of mediocre researchers. He suggests that we can no longer depend on the experts, right? He suggests that the reason why the people are justified in their disbelief of scientists like Fauci, and they're justified in not taking the vaccine because we can no longer depend on experts to tell us the truth because of cancel culture. And so he says that we need to replace science with a more structured entity he calls an institution. That way the people will be more trusting of it. I don't know how, he just suggests that we should have more trust in institutions. I don't know. He then takes all the humanity out of science and imagines a network of automatons, no longer acting as individuals, but performing a neutral formulaic algorithm for calculating the truth. What Rausch calls a social operating system, or a constitution of knowledge. This is an authoritarian system because the experts mindlessly apply the algorithm that is written by someone else. An authoritarian structure where knowledge is not determined by a democratic collection of human experts, but by the one person at the top of the institution who gets to write and change the Constitution. That is their real goal. They want the people to put their faith in the institution instead of the experts. The problem is that institutions can become corrupted. I should note the irony in an individual coming up with a theory that says we can't trust theories that are derived from individuals. Here he is talking to Steven Pinker, two guys who agree on almost everything. How much debate, rigorous thought, or intellectual exploration do you think is going on in this interview? Not much. Jonathan tells Pinker that his main inspiration was James Madison, the so-called father of the American Constitution. Rauch suggested that the newsroom is a good example of an institution that we should put our faith in, blindly put our faith in. The newsroom is dominated by the editor-in-chief. He determines the rules of the newsroom. But in reality, he's not what keeps the journalists' writing accurate. Other journalists in other newsrooms will also write articles, and if the two articles contradict, the one that is wrong will lose reputation and subscriptions. We, the readers, keep the journalists accurate, not the editor-in-chief. We shouldn't put our faith in newsrooms, we should put our faith in ourselves. The problem these days is that too many of us are not canceling our subscriptions when the newspapers get things wrong, and they know it. When a few of us try to point this out, the journalists like Pinker and Rausch scream cancel culture. Sorry, I'm sort of getting a little off topic. So why did Boghossian quit if it wasn't about cancel culture? He had the perfect job to indoctrinate vulnerable students with his anti-science ideas. Well, the story of his close friends Heather Hying and her husband Brett Weinstein is a clue. Here they are in January telling Bill Maher that COVID was definitely made in a lab. They recently started promoting ivermectin, the horse and cattle dewormer, as a cure for COVID on their podcast. They quit their university jobs back in 2017. They worked at Evergreen College, supposedly because of cancel culture. Brett's brother Eric, the chief money manager for Peter Thiel, he supposedly coined the phrase intellectual dark web because of this incident. They went on to two-year terms as visiting professors at the James Madison Society in Princeton. The visiting fellows of the James Madison program are almost always political scientists or historians or philosophers. Because James Madison was a founding father, it's located in the social sciences, not the natural sciences, right? Heather Hying and Brett Weinstein are biologists. Makes you wonder how they got that gig. As fellows, they get paid a salary but have no responsibilities whatsoever. They even listed themselves as professors in exile on the website. Far from being canceled for their political views, they actually got promoted. Since then, they've started a podcast with millions of listeners. Almost 2 million saw this Bill Maher clip on YouTube, where they tell the audience that the evil scientists created COVID to kill them. Don't trust the evil scientists at the CDC, they're lying to you. Boghossian probably saw this and realized that he could reach 1,000 times more people and make a lot more money out in the private sector. So far from being a movement, I think these people that Bill Maher listed off, I think they're just a bunch of opportunists and grifters, trying to use the moment. And most of them weren't fired or quit because of the reason they said they did. And some of them, I think, are actual literal political activists. Okay, let's see here. Okay, I wanted to say one last thing about the show. The panel had another guest besides George Will, and that was journalism professor Christina Bellantoni. I found Bill Maher to be, incredibly demeaning and condescending towards her. In this picture right here, she's shaking her head in disagreement as George Will speaks. This seemed like a conversation between Bill Maher and George Will, and they were like sort of forced to let her speak a little bit, but they didn't listen to anything she said. They blew her off, and they just talked to each other and they agreed with each other, and they, this right here, she's shaking her head in disagreement and she's about to respond when Bill Maher interrupts her, right? And he's thinking he's giving her the opportunity to speak, but he's not. He's interrupting her before she can speak. Even before she speaks, Maher goes apoplectic. He can't believe that anyone would disagree with him. So before she has anything to say, Maher complains with exasperation, and not for the first time, about the look on her face. And then he allows her to talk. He probably thinks he's being gracious to her, to let her speak. But what this whole thing was it was a warning to her not to disagree with him. Maher can't stand criticism. He's very self-conscious about the liberals on his show. If a liberal on his show disagrees with him on this cancel culture stuff or his conservative viewpoints, he won't have them back on his show. So Bellantoni says, she gives a generic response, giving her opinion. She says, this is just my opinion, but. And Maher responds with a really sarcastic, really? As if to say she's like the stupidest person in the world to believe that. Really? He says it again. You really believe that? He expressed disbelief at almost all of her opinions, sarcastically like that. One point he even laughed right in her face when she said that she thinks her students appear to her to be less narcissistic than older generations. He laughed right in her face, as if what she said was so wrong that she can't have that opinion. When Maher listed the teachers that quit, Bellantoni clearly wasn't taking their words at face value, their statements that they made supposedly when they quit. Again, he warned her not to disagree with him by talking about her face. And then Bellantoni calmly explains that while his vague examples, if they're true, are not good, but they ran counter to her personal experience as a university professor at USC. With more exasperation, Bill says, well, you're not everywhere. Apparently that no one knows more about him than life on a university campus. Not the professors, not the students, just him, because he reads things in the Washington Examiner, or others, I guess. He exclaims, at another point he exclaims, I just told you what is happening on other campuses. Like she's supposed to take his word for it and respond saying, oh yeah, that's bad, or something like that. You know, he mentions this list of people and things that are going on campus, and he says, talk about it. You know, what can you say to that? Say, oh, it's bad. Or, you know, she said the only thing that she possibly could is, that's not what I see. Bill Guest wants his guests. They're not there to debate him. He's not looking to persuade them to his opinion. He wants his guests to just take his word as the absolute truth. These fake headlines that he gets from places like Breitbart, take these headlines that sound like The Onion and take them as the absolute truth because he's saying them. And just agree with him. And just nod your head and say, yes, that's true. Everything you say is right. Or he's going to cancel them off his show. Just like the other members of the intellectual dark web, he is guilty of the very thing he is accusing others of. He cancels people because he has the power. It's his show. He can cancel people off his show. She can't cancel him. His viewers can't cancel him. The executives at HBO could cancel him, but they're not going to because they believe in cancel culture just like him. It suits their agenda. So this cancel culture thing is completely backwards. The actual people who are getting canceled are the liberals who have no power. And the people doing the canceling are the conservatives who have all the power. How are you going to cancel somebody if you have no power? Well, so that's it. The show was a mess. His opinions are a mess. Cancel culture is a mess. And they're really trying to kill science. That's their real agenda. So, if you made it here, thanks for watching or listening.